Hello and welcome to the Family Research Council. We're glad you're here. My name is Bethany DeMin. I'm the lectures coordinator here at FRC, and we're honored to have Congresswoman Cathy McMorris Rodgers here with us today. In a moment, I'll turn over the podium to our Vice President for Government Affairs, David Christensen. I just have a few housekeeping items to take care of. We do webcast all of our lectures live from here, so if you're joining us via webcast, welcome. We're glad you're with us. Also, all of our lectures are archived on our website, so please do share that link with your social networks and through email. We find that increases our reach, and we end up getting in the thousands of views oftentimes. At this time, I would like to welcome David Christensen to the podium.
Thanks, Bethany. Greetings and welcome. Thank you, Bethany. It is a real honor, and I'll do a little introduction here. To Congresswoman Cathy McMorris Rodgers. She's here to speak about the role of Congress in protecting values in life. She is the chair of the House Republican Caucus. She's the fourth highest ranking Republican in the House of Representatives. She's the highest ranking Republican woman in Congress. She represents Washington State's 5th District. The Congresswoman grew up on an orchard because her family, she became the first in her family to graduate from college. She worked in her family's small business. She understands what that's like, which represents what a lot of Americans work for small businesses. She lived the American dream, and every day she worked to craft the 21st century solutions to keep the dream alive for her 3 children and every American. First elected to the House of Representatives in 2004, Congressman McMorris Rodgers has earned the trust of her constituents, praise of her colleagues in her hard work for conservative principles, bipartisan outreach, and innovative leadership. She serves on the powerful House Energy and Commerce Committee, where almost half of all legislation that impacts the economy must pass. On the Health Subcommittee, she advances reforms that put patients and doctors in control and foster miraculous treatments and cures. An advocate for members of the military and their families, she co-founded the Bipartisan Military Family Caucus to provide military spouses and children a voice in Congress. In total, she co-chairs seven bipartisan congressional caucuses: 4-H, Diversity in Tech, Down Syndrome, Girl Scout Troop Capitol Hill, Neuroscience. Did you know there was a neuroscience caucus? Anyone? Military Family, and the Rural Health Care Coalition. I've gotten to see Congresswoman McMorris Rodgers in action, bringing Republicans together to pass the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act earlier this year after there were a few hiccups. She worked really hard, member to member, bringing together coalitions on the Hill and outside groups. And I've seen her bring faith leaders together for the National Day of Prayer. She's somebody who I think is a great representative and no better to talk about values in life. Congresswoman.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the kind introduction. It's great to be back at the Family Research Council and appreciate all that you do day in and day out. The family is the cornerstone of our society and an institution created by God. I appreciate the work that Family Research Council does to care for and protect America's families. You know, certainly the best thing that has happened to me since I was elected to Congress, 35 and single, was getting married and becoming a mom. I was the 5th to give birth while serving in Congress. I was the first to give birth twice, and then a couple of years ago, I broke my own record and had a third. And the experience of becoming a mom has only made it more clear to me the importance of family in our society. The values provided by family are really innumerable. The stability, the comfort, the guidance, so important to us as individuals. The family is the cornerstone of our communities. And as communities, we assemble for good. We work together to construct effective and representative government. Representative government must express and reflect the spirit and the character that has bound us as people since the founding of this country. In the halls of Congress, if you ever walk through the Capitol, you'll see statues, you'll see pictures of lawgivers from days gone by. If you walk into the chamber of the House of Representatives, you see a side profile of many along the walls. But there's one face that looks forward and looks directly at you. Moses. And as you stand at the front of the House chamber, facing the seats and the visitors, you look directly at his face. And why do I share this? Because the significance of this is not lost on those who have the honor of standing on the House floor. In March, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pointed to it, and he spoke of Moses' leadership of the Jews from slavery to the land of Israel. Quoting his message, "Be strong and resolute, neither fear nor dread them." And then just a month ago, Pope Francis stood at the same podium and gestured to the image, and he reflected on the two ways of Moses. One, the need of people to keep alive their sense of unity by means of just legislation. The other, leading us directly to God, and thus to the transcendent dignity of the human being. Moses, Pope Francis said, reminds us that we are asked to protect, by means of law, the image and likeness fashioned by God on every human face. This sentiment guided the hands of our founders, who with a pen and bold ideas began an unprecedented experiment in self-governance, built upon foundational Judeo-Christian values. We often speak of these values, but what do they mean today? What do they mean in 2015? It is the best of freedom, faith, and equality, that tradition that has shaped our country and the world. These beliefs inspired our founders to establish our unique form of government, not Caesars or czars, not kings or unjust parliaments, but a system that honors each individual by stating very clearly, all are created equal. Our task, in part, is to preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to posterity. As we approach the remainder of the 114th Congress, it's important to continue the efforts on Capitol Hill to promote legislation that upholds freedom, human rights, opportunity, dignity, and purpose. I'm proud of the fact that in this Congress, one of our first priorities was to combat human trafficking, protecting really the most vulnerable in our society. And we passed a package of legislation with the aim of helping the victims, offering greater resources to law enforcement, strengthening existing laws, and expanding services that protect at-risk men, women, and children. The crime of trafficking is an assault on human dignity and must be stopped. This year has also marked the state implementation of the Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, the ABLE Act. And it marks the beginning of a new chapter for millions of Americans with disabilities, one of opportunity and independence. It empowers individuals through tax-free savings accounts, similar to 529s, to save for education, transportation, or housing, with the goal of a greater ability to live independent and to work independent. This bill honors the fact that all people deserve an opportunity to pursue their full potential. Our mission to protect the dignity of human life has resulted in one of the strongest pro-life Congresses to date, moving legislation to protect the unborn. At the beginning of the year, the House passed the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act, which would ensure taxpayer dollars would not be used to fund the unspeakable act of abortion. With the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, the House outlawed abortions after 5 months, recognizing that children in the womb feel pain and deserve protection. It was a huge step forward for the pro-life movement, and it wouldn't have happened without the help of groups like the Family Research Council. Now, effective leadership is not just passing legislation. We must also send a message to the country and to the world. We need to be the ones setting the standard as to how we treat people of different faith and different walks of life. I think one of the mistakes that we often make when we're reading history or celebrating the heroes of the past is that somehow we think that they were different than we are. They weren't. They confronted the same challenges, the same weaknesses that we wrestle with today. But leaders have emerged throughout history to fight the fundamental threats to our God-given rights as individuals. As a leader in the House, I pledge to continue that fight. Last week, just this weekend, I had the chance to visit the Jefferson Memorial again. And there's a quote on the wall about religious freedom. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship or ministry, or shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief. But all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. From Thomas Jefferson to today, the protection of religious liberty has been a primary concern, but we certainly recognize there's more to be done. Right now, brothers and sisters in Christ and other ethnic and religious minorities face persecution in the Middle East. They need our support. I signed on to a resolution sponsored by one of my colleagues, Jeff Fortenberry, that expresses support for persecuted people of faith and calls for atrocities committed against them to be deemed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Here at home, this Congress stood up to protect churches and employers in the District of Columbia after D.C. had passed a law that would have forced faith-based groups to hire abortion proponents. And in so doing, we sent a signal that religious persecution anywhere is a threat to self-determination everywhere. I've also sponsored the Healthcare Conscience Rights Act. Healthcare providers who play such a critical role in our communities should not have to choose between their call to provide patient care and their deeply held religious beliefs. But that's what's happening all over the country. Last year, unaccountable bureaucrats in California's Department of Managed Health mandated that health plans start covering abortion without any vote of the people. Back home in my home state of Washington, I've been hearing from healthcare providers who are worried our state may do the same. And already lawmakers there have reintroduced legislation that would require all health insurers, including a Catholic plan, to cover abortions. Despite federal statutes that prohibit this kind of abortion, a campaign at the state level clearly requires us to pursue stronger protections for faith-based healthcare providers. And I'm working with my colleagues in the House to ensure that we are presenting the strongest possible defense to combat conscience rights violations. People of faith play such an important role in the public realm, whether it's feeding the poor, providing health care, or helping families in crisis. Yet too often, government tends to be coercive and exclusionary when it comes to religious liberty. A government that tells you how to act, how to live, how to run your organization, automatically creates a system of distrust. And as representatives and as senators, we must ensure that we retain the rightful and limited role of government by prohibiting the government itself from being the discriminator. And that's why the work being done in Congress to protect individuals and organizations that act in accordance with their faith and convictions without fear of prosecution is so important. Freedom of thought is an attribute, not a defect of our system of government. Americans should never feel that their beliefs can only be expressed inside their homes. In this country, the public square is open to people of all creeds. The House of Representatives, the People's House, embraces this obligation to every citizen and our allies around the world. We, in the House, are by design the closest to the people. We are the most accountable, and we should be the most transparent. You know, you really don't have to look any farther than the architecture of D.C. to see what our founders envisioned. It's not by mistake that the dome over the Capitol is the very center of the federal city. The White House and the Supreme Court are set around us, satellites to the supreme power of the people, expressed in the legislative authority of Congress. But the face of government has changed. Many Americans, including myself, fear that we are losing representative government. I fear that I am losing the country that I have known and loved. What was once 3 equal branches of government is now an overextended executive branch with unresponsive bureaucrats making law. You can't call them to get an answer. Congress can barely get an answer. At best, it's inefficient. At worst, government agencies have turned political and targeted innocent citizens. The IRS targeting of conservatives is one of the most disgraceful abuses of authority that I've seen in my time in office. The president has abused the system of executive orders, legislating from the Oval Office when he doesn't have the support of Congress. And we've seen this in immigration, in healthcare, and the EPA. Now the judicial branch and judges say that they have the right to legislate directly from the bench. Judicial activism, once a controversial moral debate in this country over isolated incidences, has become the norm. It's become what's expected. We are the greatest experiment in self-government the world has ever known. But with self-government does come an obligation for self-reflection. And recently, the leadership process in the House has certainly given us an opportunity for this. And through it, I've been looking for clarity. How do we make the People's House the most effective on behalf of the citizens? How do we protect the will of the people? If we do not seek answers to these questions, people are going to give up on the democratic process. If we as representatives become irrelevant, citizens will become passive observers of the process. We must rebuild the trust in this institution. And that requires us to start at the beginning and look at Article 1. Article 1 of the Constitution distinctly empowers the legislative branch, the House and the Senate, with all responsibility to establish laws for the common good. This basic function is broken when an imperial executive branch writes rules and regulations without that become and have the force of law, and an unchecked judiciary reinterprets the Constitution and the intent of laws. We talk at length in modern politics about the role of government, whether it should be limited or involved, big versus small. But we need to have a very important debate on the legislative process and on the rules that drive decision-making today. Too much of the federal government runs on autopilot due to a budgetary process that was put in place in 1974. Congress responds to rules that were put in place decades ago. And you just have to look at how the federal government, the agencies have grown over the last 50 to 70 years versus a Congress that functions basically the same way. As I stand before you today, I believe it is my duty as a representative in this great country to return Congress on behalf of every citizen in this country to its proper role in the government through Article 1. It's time to take the government off of autopilot. And that's why I'm drafting a resolution that reaffirms the House's constitutional role in restoring effective representative government. We must do our job of legislating. That best represents the will of the people. We must reestablish the balance of power. We need a modern Congress to restore constitutional balance. And in that, we need to modernize the tax code. We need to bring the VA into the 21st century. We need to introduce an innovative, responsive healthcare system to the world. You just think about the demands on families and on small businesses and on institutions, the changes that have happened. But you know what? Congress hasn't changed to keep pace. I really believe that we need to rethink government from the top down. And Article 1 is just as relevant today as it was in the 18th century. Our founders realized that every individual is made in the image of God. And we celebrate the potential that each person has, and our laws reflect the will of the people. This is the genius of America. The revolutionary system that our founders created was based upon the foundation of Judeo-Christian values, and it must continue. You know, I've been given a lot of thought recently to the words of St. Augustine from over 1,000 years ago. And he said, "Pray as though everything depended upon God. Work as though everything depended upon you." That's the spirit in which I approach each day, with prayer and with gratitude, with diligence and determination. These words embody my commitment to a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I look forward to continuing to work with the Family Research Council on our shared goals, and I welcome any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you very much.
Congresswoman, thanks so much. As a Washingtonian, although from the other part of the state, it's wonderful to have you here. We have been tracking the situation of the football coach in Bremerton, who has been attacked for simply praying after a game. Are you familiar with that situation?
I am not.
Okay. He's a retired military officer who has served faithfully. Decided instead of going to a convenient retirement to coach boys football. After the games, he goes to the 50-yard line and simply prays. He has been attacked now by the superintendent of public instruction, been told he can't pray publicly. Obviously, this is something, and his team is fully supportive of him, something that we're very concerned with. If you're not familiar, please don't feel like you need to comment, but we wanted to raise that issue and express our support for him and for those standing with him.
Well, sure, and I mentioned it in my speech, but I think the words that are etched on the Jefferson Memorial apply, that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship or ministry, or shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or beliefs. But all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions of matters of religion. And I do believe that America was founded on Judeo-Christian values, and that faith has played a very important role in the founding of this country and the continuing of this country, and that people of faith must be able to express themselves in the public square.
Penny Starr, CNS News. What would you say is the biggest threat to religious liberty in the country today? Is it the government, or how do you see that? Thank you.
You know, I believe that the biggest threat to religious liberty is really coming from activities outside of representative government, whether it is in the executive branch through rules and regulations, or in the judicial branch in court opinions, right? And that's where I believe that we must restore the role of representative government, stand on behalf of the will of the people as reflected through their representatives and senators. And I fear that that is not happening today, and that what our founders often thought would always be the strongest role of government, that the legislative branch on behalf of the people would always dominate, has really taken a back seat. And that means that the will of the people is not being reflected in so many of so much of the direction that now we see the country going, that it's being driven by outside forces. And that's why the call to really restore the rightful role of the legislative branch on behalf of the people to express the will of the people is so important, that's where the debate should take place. That's where decisions should be made.
Congresswoman, thanks for being here. My name is Travis Weber. I work here at FRC on religious liberty issues. Agree with your description of the shifts in power constitutionally among the branches, and I think the framers, would have a hard time looking at what we have today. It seems theoretically, well, constitutionally, for example, Congress could abolish the lower federal courts and alter the way the Supreme Court can operate. So legally they can do that. Yet these things don't seem to happen. So. Are there practical obstacles to some of these things happening? Is it just an issue of crossing the large amount of ground we have to get from the swollen nature of where we're at now to perhaps constitutionally reflecting Congress and the Article 1 powers. But I'm just wondering if you can comment just practically what are some of the issues with using the powers that are in place now in the Constitution for Congress to exercise.
Right. Well, it's an excellent question, and I think that we have gotten here over a longer period of time. When you look at the growth in the federal agencies, and you don't have to drive around Washington, D.C. very much before you can see, just the number of buildings that have been built even just in recent years, over the last 50, 70 years especially. There's so much growth in Washington, D.C. among federal agencies, or the courts that are becoming more and more aggressive as far as the decisions that they are making that are not in line with what the law actually says or goes beyond what the law ever intended. So, as I said, I fear that we are in this process losing representative government, and that's why the call to restore the rightful role, the role of we the people, restore decision making among the people's elected representatives is so important, and to really have this debate because it has happened over a number of years where laws have been passed that have given power to the executive branch, or the courts have been set up in a way that has allowed them to go the direction that they have. And I think we just need to become more deliberate in really looking at what are those policies and how do we as representatives, as senators, fulfill our constitutional duty to have the decisions made in the legislative branch. And I think we need to look at how we can be more effective. Congress has basically been operating the same way, and yet I think we need to be willing to have those internal discussions, the debate among the House and the Senate as to how we can function more effectively given the world in which we live today. And it's not. I mean, all you got to do is look at the polls to see that Congress's approval is not very good. And I fear that people look at us, and so often they see us as either dysfunctional or not. We're arguing rather than really having the debate that's necessary and making the decisions on their behalf and being accountable to the people. So in this process, I really think it's a call. It's a call that needs to go out to every citizen in this country on behalf of we the people to restore the rightful role of legislators and legislating and the decision making that belongs with the people.
Congressman, thank you for your comments. I was going to ask you who you're going to vote for later in terms of speaker today, but I won't do that. One of the bills that you mentioned, the Healthcare Conscience Rights Act, is really a bill to protect conscience in the sense that it binds the government from discriminating against people. And I think that there's a law, you mentioned that's on the books already, California with the abortion mandate, and insurance isn't in... they're just not complying with the law. So that bill, for people who don't know watching, that bill says that the government may not discriminate against people, healthcare providers, based on their moral, religious beliefs and objections to abortion, and then provides a private right of action so that pastors in California can sue the government. The First Amendment Defense Act is similar on the marriage question, that the government may not discriminate against people on the basis that they believe marriage is between a man and a woman. We had worked, and other groups had worked, I think it was called the Cromnibus last year, to pass protections like the abortion non-discrimination or improve those protections to bind the agencies that you were talking about. Do you see any way forward going into the in the next couple months, whether it's appropriations bills, to try to move those kinds of conscience protections, religious freedom protections? Can you talk about that? There's a lot of moving parts.
Right.
Those bills have a lot of complicated matters. Can you just kind of maybe talk us forward how we can try to advocate those things?
Sure. Well, on where we find ourselves, I do see an opportunity for us to attach some language to either these appropriations bills or some kind of a budget negotiation in later on in December that would strengthen some of these protections. You mentioned the Healthcare Conscience Rights Act. Yes, there is legislation on the books, but I think there's a growing number of people that believe that it needs to be strengthened, and that one way that we could do that is by attaching some language to one of the appropriations bills, and we're having those discussions right now. You're probably aware that there is a proposed budget deal right now that could even be voted on this week that would set the top line budget numbers, and the reason that is so important is because as you think about the House and the Senate doing the foundational work of writing a budget, authorizing spending, really the power of the purse, it only happens as we do our jobs of passing the legislation. And if we don't pass the legislation, if we don't pass an appropriations bill, then we have this process in place right now, goes back to 1974, that basically the federal government stays on autopilot. So it's really, the burden is on us to do our jobs. And unfortunately, that hasn't been happening. But that's where getting the budget deal in place, those top line numbers, so that we can go to work with the Senate. I've been very frustrated with a Senate that has refused to bring any of the 12 appropriations bills to the floor, because that's really shutting down the debate, shutting down the democratic process in the Senate. So, and I know this is all internal and kind of process driven, but it goes to a question before all of us as to how do we do our job on behalf of the people that elected us to represent them, and the importance of doing our jobs. And so these appropriations bills, step one is to get a budget in place, and then step two is the appropriations bills. And yes, there is an opportunity both on the human, or on the Healthcare Conscience Rights Act, as well as religious freedom provisions that could potentially be considered as those bills move through the process.
Just to follow up on the budget, so do you support do you plan to vote for the budget that Speaker Boehner has proposed?
Yes, I do plan to support it, and I believe it is important that we get these top line agreed upon numbers in place so that we can go to work on these important provisions. I'm also quite encouraged, and I'm hopeful. They're still working out the final details, but one provision is to get an agreement by the Senate that they would pass appropriations bills with a 50-vote threshold, because this 60-vote requirement to proceed, the motion to proceed, has really shut it all down. And there's encouraging conversations going on with our Senate colleagues to actually reduce that threshold to 50 votes, which would then facilitate us being able to do our jobs, which, again, it's the fundamental role that we have as representatives is to pass a budget, pass the appropriations bills. That's how we exercise our authority on behalf of the people.
I'll ask another question. So for a lot of our viewers who are watching you speak right now and who will watch this in the future, what message do you have for them to be engaged in the political process? So there might be some frustration, but if people aren't engaged, what would you do to encourage people?
I would encourage people that each person makes a difference, and I would encourage them, each one of us, as citizens of this great country, have a responsibility and an opportunity to be involved, and it starts with each one of us in our own lives, in our own families, in our own communities, doing our part. As you see the need, helping meet the need. I look at, or I hear from a lot of people that they're frustrated with what's going on in Congress or the federal government. But to a certain degree, you don't want the federal government to be solving these problems. You want to have the freedom to make those best decisions yourselves, in your family, in your community. And my job is really to give people more freedom, more opportunity. And I really do trust individuals to make those better decisions for themselves. I really believe that individuals, family, communities will always make better decisions than the federal government. So I think first and foremost, it is just stepping up, each one of us, and not just looking to someone else. I think it's easy to point the finger and say, well, that person should be doing this, or that person should be saying that. You know what? Start with yourself. What can you be doing? What can each one of us be doing? And it takes all of us. It takes each one of us with the responsibilities that we've been given to do our part. And yes, you know, definitely it makes a difference to make the phone calls, voice your opinion on whatever the legislation may be in Congress. You need to be active. But is it even as simple as, you know, we are all people, you know, representatives, senators, we're all people. And I think you'll find it simpler than you realize, maybe even just to sit down and have a cup of coffee with a representative and talk to them about some of these issues and explore how you can get more involved. And at the end of the day, you know, you should consider running for office, whatever it may be, whether it's school board, whether it's city council, you know, your county, your state, maybe run for Congress. But that's how you make a difference, is each one of us doing our part. Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.